thank you everyone for being here. Thank you, Cyril, for hosting this conference, which is the first of a short cycle of 3 events that we organized with Paola Viganò and Loan Laurent at the Habitat Research Center in the frame of the exhibition Water Designs that we curated together with Archizoom, Cyril, Roxane, Solène, and all the equipe. We are very glad of being here today with this fantastic opening. Paola Viganò should be here, and she's running a few minutes late. She's having a PhD jury, end of a PhD exam right now, so we prefer to start, not to wait, to respect my colleague Anna Carla that is passing her exam right now. So I'll give Paola the time to reach in a few minutes, and I will, in the meanwhile, just introduce our guest. We are very honored, I have to say. First, glad that there is a lot of students there, and not only students, former students, extra public that we are very glad to have here today. So our guest today is Professor Whiston Spirn. I have the task, which is not easy, to introduce briefly the long career of Whiston Spirn. Let's start from what she's doing right now. She's a Cecil and Ida Green Distinguished Professor of Landscape Architecture and Planning at MIT in Boston. She has been previously Professor of Landscape Design at Harvard University and at Penn University, University of Pennsylvania, where you have been studying, and then you have been also chair of the department. She has a long history of academia, let's say, in the United States. She's a landscape designer. She's a photographer. She's an engaged teacher. She spent a couple of hours with our student this morning, and they realized how much of an engaged teacher she is. And she's an author of many fundamental books. The Granite Garden that we have in the small book table in our exhibition, Language of Landscapes, and many others that in a way represent the more theoretical part of her work. In this evening, she will rather stay focused on design operations and everything that has to do with design. She received many prizes. I will just list here the International Cosmos Prize in 2001 and the Joe Jellicoe Award for Landscape Design in 2018. So to a certain extent, it was very natural for us to invite Whiston Spirn in the frame of our exhibition, because as we were discussing today, the 4 different line or disciplinary paths that we propose to explore in the exhibition: landscape design, environmental history, let's say, and sciences, but also laws and political ecology in a way, society. They're extremely, let's say, pertinent to what Anne is doing since many years. She's therefore here in the frame of water designs, but also for the program participant to the MIS program in urban and territorial design. Tonight is the first urban and environmental theory session. The theme of our semester is counter projects, counter spaces. As what Anne will present today, mostly, I'm assuming, because I had passed through the slide, but I'm assuming is a long-lasting project started in 1987 in the West Philadelphia Landscape Project. And in a way, what she's doing is concretely developing a counter project. A counter project because it is proposing a different narrative for the future, and it is producing concrete counter spaces. So I let Anne walk through the long 30 almost years of experience, and then the idea is that at the end we keep at least half an hour for questions. So we are very open to questions coming from the audience. So thank you very much, Anne.
Thank you so much. I don't know how many of you had a chance to look at the exhibit, but it's a tour de force. I recommend that everyone look at it, looking at the many dimensions of water in society. Yes, and thank you for coming tonight. Welcome. One day, many years ago, I saw an enormous hole in the street. I crept to the edge, looked down into this deep hole, and was astonished to see a big brown rushing river. The buried river spoke to me. You walk on rivers. We flow under city streets and buildings. You may bury us, but our force cannot be subdued. The buried river was a revelation. Cities are part of the natural world. The cave-in was a warning. We ignore the forces of nature at our peril. The buried river was a sign. We need to adapt the city to natural processes. The buried river posed a challenge: how to overturn centuries of conventional city building that aims to control through brute force powers of air, earth, water, and life. How to transform a system that was meant to protect city residents that now threatens health and safety. How to design a new system and a transition from the old. This is not a challenge to explore in the abstract. It calls for engagement with real people in real places to make discoveries from which principles can be drawn. My talk today is the story of a quest to understand the river's revelation, to interpret its signs, to meet its challenge, to heed the cave-in's warning. Mill Creek is the name of the buried river that spoke to me, the questions it posed, and my search for answers led to a series of ever-deepening mysteries and discoveries. Where did the buried river flow? Why was it buried? And what were the consequences of that burial? The search for the buried river led through historical atlases and archives to maps of its topography and territory, to investigations in basements and streets, in design experiments in partnership with children and teachers, community gardeners, water engineers, and public officials. My first attempt to answer the questions posed by the buried river was to write a book, The Granite Garden, Urban Nature and Human Design, which looked at the elements, the dimensions of air, earth, water, life, and the urban ecosystem. And in each of these sections to present the processes that we all need to pay attention to in designing and planning for the city, but also examples from history and from contemporary cities who have adapted successfully to urban climate, to things like earthquakes and subsidence, to water, floods and water quality, to plants and animals, and to the forces of the urban ecosystem. Now, one thing that frustrated me after the book was published, it got widely recognized and reviewed, but one thing that frustrated me was that people would say, well, I can understand how you could use these ideas to design new towns, but what about existing cities? They're already built. This was so frustrating because at the time, most of the work that the firm I worked with before I started teaching, the work of landscape architects and planners at the time was mostly in developing new towns and new resorts. And why couldn't we go into existing cities? So I started research. I was teaching at Harvard at the time the book was published. And I started a series of research studios and research, academic research into this issue of vacant urban land, because in parts of Boston, where I was at the time, the vacant lands, there were some, the city didn't know quite how many vacant lands there were. They estimated maybe 15,000 vacant house lots that had once been built on. So what you see here on the screen is an aerial view of a neighborhood, a low-income neighborhood in Boston's Roxbury and Dorchester neighborhoods, which was once completely built with houses and businesses. And the vacant land that you see here became vacant over time. The conventional wisdom was that these vacancies were the result of absentee landlords who were burning down their buildings in order to collect the insurance money because it was such a low-income neighborhood and the buildings were deteriorated. But in fact, what I discovered was the story was much more complex. So in mapping these buried, this vacant land, here you see all the orange areas were now vacant in the 1980s and were once built on. But what I noticed when I actually went to the neighborhood, so a friend of mine recruited me to look at this neighborhood. She said, I think you really should come to the Dudley Street neighborhood because about between 30 and 40% of the land is vacant. And so I had in my mind, it was like Swiss cheese. Do you have Swiss cheese? That term here in Switzerland, I don't know. But in the US, when we refer to Swiss cheese, it's cheese with holes in it. And that's what I thought it would be, kind of an overall pattern. But when I actually visited and did some preliminary field work, I discovered that whenever we went uphill, the vacant land disappeared. And there was no vacant land on the hilltops and less vacant land on the hillsides. But down in the valley bottoms, which you see here in this triangular area bounded by two streets to the north and to the coming down from the right side to the center bottom, that this was a valley bottom. And so I wondered, so why is the vacant land so concentrated in the valley bottom? Was there a stream here once? And I went to historical atlases and discovered, yes, in fact, there was a stream, and it was buried in a sewer in the 19th century, covered over, and houses built on top. And there were signs, in fact, that you could read in the field. There was a street right along the buried river that was called Brook Avenue, which a brook is like a small stream. So at the time, the most difficult, most pressing environmental problem facing the city of Boston was the pollution of Boston Harbor by combined sewer overflows. So the combined sewers, which I know you have here in Switzerland as well, and in Lausanne, I think the Flan is partly stormwater drainage and partly sewage, raw sewage. And it was also the case in Boston as an older American city. And with all of the stormwater and sewage flowing in to the harbor, this was causing this heightened pollution of the water, which prevented people many times during the summer from using the beaches and getting into the water. And the city, the region was then sued to clean up the harbor. So this was headline news in the 1980s in Boston. And I thought to myself, why don't we the plan was to build this huge new sewage treatment plant. I think it was at the time, it was going to be one of the largest sewage treatment plants in the world. And to treat all of the excess sewage that came from after heavy rainstorms when there was too much stormwater added to the sanitary sewage so that the overflow went directly into the harbor. This diagram illustrates what I'm saying here. So you have the water from homes and businesses that's been used coming into the sewer pipe. And then what happens when you have a heavy rainstorm, there's too much water and it goes directly into the waterways. So I said, let's take another look at this vacant land on the valley bottoms. Why not just use these valley bottoms to create detention basins or retention basins to hold the stormwater and prevent it from getting right away into the sewers? And here we have low-income neighborhoods. Why not use, instead of using billions of dollars to build this new sewage treatment plant. Why not use the money to rebuild the neighborhoods and to create new green, what we call now green infrastructure, to be both serve an engineering purpose at the same time as creating parks and open space in these deteriorated neighborhoods. So my ideas got a lot of attention. This was an article from the Boston Globe in May 1995 about the ideas that I had. I was asked to give a public lecture in the public library, and it's in Boston. With the crowd was completely filled, the auditorium. I think there were hundreds of people there, and I laid out these ideas, and a journalist called me up and decided he wanted to write an article about it, and so it was featured in the newspaper. I was then contacted by members of the governor's cabinet to come and present these ideas to them. And the one thing I want to point out is these were not new ideas. The only new thing about my idea was taking ideas about preventing floods using open space to hold stormwater to prevent flooding. It hadn't been used to prevent combined sewer overflows, but I'm basically working within a tradition that's many years old. And here you see the Riverway by Frederick Law Olmsted, which is part of the Emerald Necklace, which is featured right at the beginning of the exhibit here at EPFL. And then at the same time, in the 1970s and 80s, the city of Denver, with a collaboration between planners, landscape architects, and water engineers, was in the process of creating a whole network of open space systems like the one that you see here to slow down the flow of the water during heavy rainstorms and snow melt from the mountains, to keep the Platte River from flooding, because they had a huge problem with flooding. And it did. And so you can see also there are some illustrations of some of those projects in the exhibit here that was put together and is now open. Now, did you think that the city of Boston took my ideas to heart? Here's the big sewage treatment plant. And for those of you who now fly into Boston Airport, you may have flown over these big round tanks and wondered what they were. Well, they're part of this big new sewage treatment plant. So I reflected. This is a process of action research where you have a hypothesis and you try out your ideas in reality, or you make proposals, and then you see whether the proposals are accepted or not. And if they're not accepted, you reflect, why not? If they are accepted and something gets built, then you watch what happens afterwards. If you run into obstacles, you try to think try to understand these obstacles and try again. And so action research is this iterative process of reflection, action, reflection, action, reflection, action, reflection. So I reflected on this failure, and I thought, this is such a sensible idea. It's going to cost so much less money than building the sewage treatment plant. And it's also going to address social justice issues at the same time. And we don't have money. The city of Boston didn't have money to address both of these problems, the disinvestment in the low-income inner-city neighborhoods and building this new humongous sewage treatment plant and taking care of environmental quality. So why not put them together? Why not invest this money instead of in a sewage treatment plant into green infrastructure? So I figured the reason that I failed here, these ideas failed, was because they came too late in the process. That the government of the region and the state government had already proposed the sewage treatment plant. There were engineers that were already doing environmental impact statements looking at 2 different sites. And there were contractors in the wings just waiting to get the contracts to build this new thing. So I figured, okay, I was too late in the process. But in 1986, I moved to Philadelphia, to the University of Pennsylvania. And I thought, now is my chance to start early, right? I learned that the city was planning a new plan for West Philadelphia, which is where the university was. And I thought, if I can just get in here early with my research assistants and students and work on these proposals, that I'll be able to persuade the city to take these ideas seriously. So I founded the West Philadelphia Landscape Project in 1987. I'd already done this work in Boston and discovered the correlation between vacant land and valley bottoms and buried floodplains of former streams that were buried in sewers. And so I began with the water as the subject that I was going to be looking at. And I knew that the city of Philadelphia, like Boston, an older city with combined sewer overflows, was soon going to be facing pressure from the federal government to stop the combined sewer overflows into the river, which is also the source of the city's drinking water. So I established the West Philadelphia Landscape Project as a laboratory for generating, exploring, and testing models for restoring urban nature and rebuilding low-income communities. Those were my research questions. How to restore the urban natural environment and rebuild low-income communities in synergistic ways to create places that are functional, sustainable, meaningful, beautiful, reparative, and just. So I went in there looking at buried floodplains as a resource to prevent floods, to restore regional water quality, and to rebuild communities. The thing about water also is that water has funding to support projects because in Philadelphia, for example, the Philadelphia Water Department has responsibility for drinking water and water supply to homes and businesses. It has responsibility for managing stormwater, and it has responsibility for managing the sewage treatment. So the water department levies bills. You know, people pay for their water. There's a revenue stream. Water departments can embark on large projects and issue bonds and get the funds to build these projects. So I realized also on reflection that there was more support financially for dealing with water than, for example, dealing with urban forestry or other aspects of the urban natural environment. On the other hand, you could start with water and then fold in urban ecosystems and issues around climate and forests. So I chose to work in an urban watershed, which you see here, this red sort of oval, is the Mill Creek watershed in West Philadelphia. The lower portion of it is within 2 subway stops of the University of Pennsylvania. It's a 5-minute bicycle ride, a few minutes by car. And it just happens to be that buried river that once spoke to me when I was a student, graduate student at the University of Pennsylvania. So this is a newspaper report about this cave-in that I saw in 1971. But when I saw it, this photograph is just showing the beginning of it. When I saw it in September, it went for an entire block from building wall to building wall. It was enormous. So the first step of the research that I started was in search of the buried river. Where is it? Where does it flow? Why was it buried? And literally, where is this buried river? So here's a 1988. Many of you work with geographic information systems, I can imagine. And this is a vintage 1988 pioneering GIS map. The orange line, the blue lines that you see here are streams, former streams. All but one are now buried. the Mill Creek runs right through the center of West Philadelphia, and you see the orange line is the sewer that the Mill Creek was put into. If you go across the city line into the suburbs, you can actually see the tributaries to Mill Creek. They still flow above ground. But as soon as they go over the city line, they enter a sewer. I looked through old photographs and archives and found this photograph, for example. In fact, actually, this photograph was discovered by a student of mine in one of my classes, and it's classic. It shows the process of construction of this Mill Creek sewer in the 1880s. And what I want you to notice, at the time, it was thought to be the largest sewer in the world. It was 20 feet in diameter, still is. But I want you to notice the mode in which this sewer is being constructed and the way that the river is being buried. If you look in the upper left-hand corner of this photograph, you see there's already, part of the sewer has already been completed. And you see the darker gray area just above the sewer is probably soil, because the construction happened by partly digging out and then filling over the sewer. And look at that line of lighter soil on above it. And then look what's on top of that. Houses have already been constructed. The sewer has just been finished and filled in, and the houses are already being constructed. Now, last spring, I had the luck of being in West Philadelphia, because I'm now in Boston, and my work is still in West Philadelphia. I had the luck of being in West Philadelphia when a playground for a school that I had begun working with was being dug up in order to install stormwater detention by the Philadelphia Water Department as one of their projects. And so there was this huge mound of fill. So I could actually see what that fill consisted of. And guess what? It was full of glass bottles and of all different colors. There were leather boots from, the 1880s. There were all kinds of artifacts, and then there were cinders. So this is a kind of fill that's going to settle over time. And what do you think happened to these houses that you see that were built over on that fill? Well, you already know the story, right? You can guess. Here you see a later version of Geographic Information System from 2012 showing a part of the Mill Creek neighborhood. So this Mill Creek is an entire watershed, but there's also a neighborhood within that watershed whose name is Mill Creek. And this is a neighborhood I've been working with since 1987. The darker gray area that you see, that zone from the upper left to the lower right, that gray zone is an attempt to map the buried floodplain. Where was the buried floodplain? And I had to make a hypothesis here and say, well, let's map the low spots, connect the low spots in the topography, and then go 10 feet above the lowest spot and call that the buried floodplain. Now, within that zone, the red areas that you see here are vacant lands. And you can see here how most of these vacant lands, particularly the large areas of red, are within that gray zone. The green diagonal that you see here is the result of a 1961 cave-in that resulted in the destruction of over 160 homes. And it wasn't rebuilt on, it was turned into a series of playgrounds and playing fields. So it's open space, recreation space. But outside of that gray zone of the buried floodplain, you see most of the vacant lots are just individual building lots, just, these narrow rectangles. Here is the first homes that caved in over that 1961 cave-in that I just told you about. It happened during the night and 3 people were killed. And then the cave-in continued along that diagonal, and the city came in and condemned many of the buildings in that area. And this, it's still vacant today. This is the area that I just showed you here now looks like this. So it turns out in research through newspaper reports, I found that in fact these cave-ins had been happening within, let's see, 1880, within 40 years of the time the sewer was buried, there were already cave-ins. And I could find a series of newspaper articles and photographs about the cave-ins. Here you see one in 1952. There are trucks that fell in and cars that fell into the holes, houses and porches. But then in 2012, a friend of mine found these topography maps from the 19th century that had 5-foot contour intervals. And these depicted the river itself, the stream itself. You see in the blue line there. This is the exact area that I just showed you in the previous GIS we did from 2012. And this is a map from 1874. It's before it became a streetcar suburb. So this was farmland, and there was a mill. There was a mill here that took its power from Mill Creek. And so I got a research assistant, an MIT student, who digitized all of these maps of the topography, stitched them together, and then overlaid them with contemporary topography. And that gave us the actual location and depth of the buried floodplain, which you see here. And this was from 2015. So it turned out that if you looked at the entire watershed, that anywhere from the original elevation of the valley bottom was between 20 and 60 feet below the current elevation. So when you're standing, and each one of these color changes here in the Mill Creek neighborhood represents 5 feet of elevation change. The dark blue being the most fill. It also enabled us to see where whole hillsides, whole hills were cut down and used to fill in the valley bottom. So it wasn't only garbage; it was also soil fill from adjacent hills. So that's the story of the search for the buried floodplain. And the interesting thing, some of you may be wondering, well, how does this match up with my hypothesis about if you took the low point and went 10 feet up in elevation, and that would be the buried floodplain? It turned out that that hypothesis worked out pretty much, that was where the buried floodplain was. So I was thinking these are areas that probably shouldn't be built on. But when I presented these maps to the engineers at the Philadelphia Water Department, one of the engineers said, "Oh, this is really interesting." And what he was interested in was not so much in terms of not building on them. He said, we could tap down, knowing now where the buried floodplain is, we could tap down into the sands and gravels of the original floodplain and take the stormwater and pour it down these pipes into the sands and gravels of the original floodplain, and then it would just flow through. Now, I don't know if they've actually adopted that idea yet or not, but it was an interesting thought. It was something I never thought of. So at the same time as the search for the buried river, which frankly has taken the entire, I'm still in search of the buried river. It's been an ongoing process from the very beginning of the project in 1987. But the first phase of the project from 1987 to 1991 was funded by a grant to work with a community gardening organization. And so our project was the West Philadelphia Landscape Plan and Greening Project, where we were both designing and building community gardens with residents in these neighborhoods, in West Philadelphia. And we were also, my students and I were also developing plans for larger landscape plans for vacant land in the neighborhood. And here you see, in this collage, we're working with community gardeners and we're making plans. And here's one of the four it was a 4-part plan. This one is Mill Creek Park. And you see here the bird's eye view there of where we designated the Mill Creek Park, and we did things like we didn't call for the stream to be daylighted. We didn't call for the stream to be brought up above ground because it's sanitary sewage. It's sanitary and storm sewage. And what we did call though for was to develop designs that would recall the creek itself and make people realize that they're walking on water. And so one idea, for example, was to plant red maples, Acer rubrum, all along the streets within the buried floodplain. So Acer rubrum turns brilliant red leaves in the fall. And in the spring, its buds come out like tiny flowers of red. And it's like a red haze when you look at a grove of red maple. So the idea was that buried floodplain would be revealed twice a year. And then the idea also was that there could be various kinds of uses that would still admit for retention basins and detention basins to hold the stormwater. That it wouldn't have to all be public open space. It could be, for example, nurseries, plant nurseries, for example, or other kinds of commercial uses that could still serve to retain the stormwater. So here are two of, I think there are about 5 different monographs, research monographs we produced in 1991. 2 of them you see here are Vacant Land, a Resource for Reshaping Urban Neighborhoods, and the West Philadelphia Landscape Plan, a Framework for Action. These can be downloaded. You can download these for free, either at the West Philadelphia Landscape Project website, which is wplp.net, or my own website, whistonspirn.com. And we made these freely available to the city planners. We remember, I knew that there was going to be a plan for West Philadelphia that they were in the process of developing. They were just beginning in 1991, and it was going to be produced by 1994. So I was very careful to invite them in and share our findings with them, share our maps, share our database, share these reports with all the ideas. And right, you make sensible proposals. So of course they're going to be adopted, right? They're sensible? No. 1994, the Philadelphia Planning Commission published the plan for West Philadelphia. The plan ignored issues of the watershed and subsidence in Mill Creek. And not only that, but Nehemiah Foundation, a foundation of churches, Black churches, built townhouses for first-time homeowners on the buried floodplain in Mill Creek. Okay. What's the problem here? What's happening? Why? It's not because I didn't get into the process early enough, right? That's what I thought at first. So what were the obstacles? Well, I wish that I had read Bent Flyvbjerg, who's a Danish geographer. I wish that I had read his book, Rationality and Power. It didn't come out in English until 1998, though it was published in Danish in 1991. But if I had read that book, I would have had a much better understanding. I've been reading it now because it's really helping me to understand the whole process of what I've been through over the past 40 years with these ideas. But, failure is important, actually. Failure reveals the invisible. And reflection on failure can lead to discovery and open new doors. So faced with this failure, I'm thinking, okay, what to do? Meanwhile, they're building in the Mill Creek neighborhood houses on vacant land on the buried floodplains that they're selling to first-time low-income homeowners. This isn't fair, right? This isn't just. But how do I get to the community? You know, how do I go to the newspapers or the television? But I realized that at that time, there was no good news ever written about the Mill Creek neighborhood or other neighborhoods in this part of West Philadelphia, which is low income and virtually all Black residents at the time. And so I had been working with community gardeners who were senior citizens. They tended to be elderly. They were wonderful people, but for the most part, their children had grown up and moved out. So how do I reach the adults in the neighborhood? And what I decided was to go into a school. And I didn't, one of the reasons that it occurred to me to go into a school is that the University of Pennsylvania from the early 90s on had a program called Community Partnerships, the Center for Community Partnerships. And the idea there was that professors would teaching their courses, as part of their course would take their students into a school in West Philadelphia, and that the projects that the college and university students did in the school with the children would all be connected to the intellectual content of the university class. And so I went to the director, Ira Hargavy, who had been after me for years several years, because it had only been founded a few years before, to get involved with the school project. So I said, okay, I'm ready. I'll start working with a school, but it should be on the buried floodplain. He said, and also I would prefer to work with middle school students, not elementary and not high school. So middle school are students between 6th and 8th grade, which means 12-year-olds, 11, 12, 13, 14 is the age range. Because by the time students get to high school, they're already on their way, one way or the other. And the elementary school students, the young students, still have to get through adolescence. So I thought, if you could reach middle school students, you could change the trajectory of their lives and open up opportunities. So I said, the first thing is the school must be on the buried floodplain. And secondly, if possible, in middle school. He said, I don't know where the buried floodplain is. I said, so just give me the addresses of schools. And so he starts rattling off a number of addresses, and he gets to Salzburger Middle School, 48th and Fairmount. I said, bingo, that's it. It's on the buried floodplain. It's a middle school. And not only that, it's only a block away from a community garden where I've been working since 1988. And so I went to the president of the community garden, and he was very enthusiastic about getting involved with the school. And he and I went in and talked to the principal and persuaded her to let us do this program. So I started working with my graduate students with a landscape architecture studio, where we gave them the project to do. I'll tell you a little bit more about that later. Let me just describe the school a bit for you first. So here you see the school in the distance on the right, and you can see a vacant lot here in the foreground. So there were a lot of vacant lots, a lot of vacant land near the school. The school was actually on on one side of the school, it was on the buried floodplain, and the other side, the entrance to the school, was on the floodplain terrace, about 10 or 15 feet above the lower valley bottom. So my students in a course called The Power of Place went into an 8th grade classroom in the spring, and the idea was to teach the kids about the history of their neighborhood, the environmental history, the history of the Buried River, but also the political and economic and social history that influenced the shape of the landscape today. So we were teaching them basically landscape literacy, how to read social, political, economic, and natural processes that were shaping their landscape. They really thought that the landscape had always been the way it was. They didn't have a sense, and so this was a revelation going through learning about the history. And I said, no lectures. We're just going to bring in primary documents, which are old maps, old photographs. Here you see one of my students showing the kids a photograph of the construction of the sewer after a collapse. And you can see how we're working. Each of my students is working with a table with 5 or 6 kids. We showed them maps of the 1872. Here you see on the left, the river before it was put in the sewer. You see the old mill, and you see really in the center left was where the school is today. We showed them this photograph that I spoke of later. We showed them this atlas from 1927. You see Sulzberger Middle School is right there on the upper left. And remember that curving line here with the houses built on top? Can you see the curving line? The line of the sewer and all the houses on top? None of those houses are here today. None of them. And we saw this. They saw these newspaper articles about the collapse. Now, this is when they really got excited. I mean, they were sort of interested. We started with the Native Americans and William Penn meeting the Native Americans, and we moved into the mills. And this was all kind of a bit abstract for them. But when we got to the cave-ins, they really were riveted. And I remember one student, my students were doing all the teaching. What they would do was they would ask leading questions. So for example, here they would say, can you find where we are? Can you find where we are on this map? And so the students would look at the street names, and some of them had been changed, but there were enough of them that were the same that they could find where they were. And when they looked at this and this, they really quickly were able to jump and see that this place was this place. And when they then saw the cave-ins, I remember I was there with the teacher, and I were watching what was going on every week. It was once a week. We went in once a week for 8 weeks. And I remember one child saying, "You mean there really was a creek?" You know, it became real for her when she saw the cave-ins. Now, the other reason for the cave-ins and for this issue is not just the fact that the housing was built on top of the buried river and it was filled in, because there are places in wealthy neighborhoods where this has also happened. But when you have disinvestment at the same time as these environmental issues, it can lead to collapse. And we also took these maps that were originally prepared in the 1930s by real estate agents that were created. Well, they were created for real estate agents, and they rated the blocks for how by what populations were living there. So, for example, all these red areas were areas that were inhabited by Black folks. This is a time in the 1930s, toward the beginning of the Great Migration of Black folks from South to northern cities, and they moved into areas like West Philadelphia and the Mill Creek neighborhood, which you're seeing here. And they settled first in the bottomlands and then spread out. And where you see the red hashes, diagonal lines, that's showing areas that are moving from majority white to majority black. The blue areas are Italians. I mean, for some reason, they felt that Italians were Americans were not desirable. And oh no, it was the green that was the Italian Americans, and the blue were Jewish people. And so these maps were taken and used not only by realtors but also by banks. And there's a phenomenon called redlining, where banks took this information and then did not give loans for mortgages, for home purchase, and for home improvements or small businesses in these areas that were rated low by the real estate industry. And so imagine taking a map like this into this classroom of 13 and 14-year-olds, and we thought, how do we deal with it? We expected them to be angry, and one of my students had the idea. She said, "Let's role play. Let's say, okay, we're in the 1960s, and the community group, these different groups of students would be subcommittees of the larger community, and each of them had a task. The task of one of the groups was to go and find out how they could get loans for small businesses and for people to purchase houses, and to come back and report at the end of the class to the rest of the class, and to come up with proposals and ideas." So one of the groups looked at redlining. I'll just show you this. I'll go forward to this. This is a group of the kids. By the end of the semester, we had, I asked some of the city planners to come in and let the students propose their ideas for the future of the neighborhood. And this group said to this woman, "What are you doing about redlining? Why haven't you started a community bank?" Because their idea was, that day that they did the role playing, was, why should we give our money to banks if they won't make loans to us? Why don't we just establish a community bank? Yes, that's what we should do. And so this person here said, "Whoa, that's, interesting ideas." And here they are discussing it with her. We also started a summer program where the kids went to the community garden that was a block away, and they spent half of the morning in the community garden. They designed a compost bin and built it. They designed a pond and constructed that. We taught them HTML code. Now, this is 1997, 98. The first West Philadelphia Landscape Project website was 1996 in the winter. The New York Times first website was 2 months before ours. So this is early days of the web. And we taught these kids how to do HTML code. So they wouldn't have to buy software. They could just learn the code. And at that time, HTML code, and it still is actually not that complicated, but it was really not at all complicated at the time. The kids really loved it. And they created their own website, which is part of the West Philadelphia Landscape Project website. And you can still see today the websites that they created, like this. And so landscape literacy was fundamental to this project. And here you see 3 girls with the map from 1872 in their hands for this area, a vacant area around them. And what they're discovering is that this huge block of vacant land is actually 6 different blocks that became vacant. And if they went under the grove of trees, there's a fire hydrant. And if you dig around that fire hydrant, there's a curb. So this is urban archaeology. So landscape literacy, I would say, is a fundamental skill. To read the world is empowering. And landscape literacy involves both reading the world and envisioning how to transform the world. The West Philadelphia Landscape Project was a laboratory for my book that was published in 1998, The Language of Landscape. And if you read it, there are examples from cases from all over the world, but every single chapter has a case from the West Philadelphia Landscape Project. So as I mentioned, we started our website in 1996 in the spirit of making all of our data and ideas and proposals free and open to the public. We posted our maps, and again, this is a vintage 1988 or early 1990s topographical low points GIS map. And then as I mentioned, in the fall, my graduate student studio in landscape architecture at the University of Pennsylvania, starting in fall 1996, went into the school, and they were tasked with taking a vacant lot next to the school and turning it into a wetland water garden that was also an outdoor classroom for the school and a stormwater detention area. So this is the homepage that they designed. These are the project pages. So you can go, these are the 4 different assignments. And all of this work is still on the web. Here's a design by one of the students. It's actually a diagram showing how do you get stormwater from streets and roofs and direct it to this vacant lot, which is on the right-hand side of this plan, and they worked it out. I asked the faculty member teaching the landscape engineering class if he could make the final project, the grading and the water plans, water engineering for their final project that was designed in their studio as his final project, which he did. So these were detailed topographically. Here you see a section of the plan to bring the water from the street on the left to the vacant lot on the right. You look at the section C, and here's what you see. So it's all worked out. The idea is to reach the water engineers and show them that this actually could happen. And when learning is real, youth can be agents of change. The audience for their studio projects was not just the faculty and other students. We were aiming to influence the city water department and the city planners. And if you think back, I don't know how many of you knew were using the internet in 1996, but it was pretty slow. It was really slow. And you had to dial up from your home on your telephone line. So while you were hooked up to the internet, you couldn't use your phone. It was really slow. So we made a CD-ROM, and it turned out of the entire website. And it turned out that it was, we could make 100, but it didn't cost that much more to make 500. And so the dean gave us the money to create 500 CD-ROMs. I still have boxes. But I asked the students to each student listed 5 people that they would like a CD-ROM sent to, and I made sure that we distributed them to the water engineers. And 1999, I get a call from an engineer at the water department that said, well, these ideas you've been talking about, Ann, we have this engineer visiting from Colorado who's done a lot of work in green infrastructure. Would you take us for a tour of the Mill Creek and show us where you're thinking about these projects? And so we went off together. I printed out historical maps and showed them where the buried floodplain was. And they said, oh, yeah, this could work. This could work. And so that afternoon, after we finished the tour, we went to a bar and had beers. And we spent probably an hour or 2 talking about the possibilities. And they decided they would do a demonstration project, and they'd apply for a grant, and they would take this vacant lot where the students had worked on for their project, and they would also work with the Salzburger Middle School and do a demonstration project and then evaluate it and see whether these ideas could really work on a citywide scale. So I was very pleased, obviously, and but then I moved to Boston, to MIT, and the reason I moved to MIT was that the colleagues I could see that there were colleagues there that could help me understand better the obstacles that I'd been facing with the West Philadelphia Landscape Project, and so I figured, well, the water department's now kind of moving along. I still want to keep working with the middle school, so I did continue to work with the teachers that I'd been working with at this point for 5 years, and we did. It started out fine, and they cleared all of this land, and they actually, the land they cleared was a public housing project by Louis Kahn, the great American architect, but it had been built literally on the buried river, and it was problematic in terms of water, and so they did a project here for affordable housing, and that's what you see. You see the construction here. So things are going along really well, right? 2002. The Commonwealth of Pennsylvania took over the Philadelphia School District and appointed Edison Schools, Inc., a for-profit education management program company, to manage Salzburger Middle School. The key teachers resigned, and that ended the Salzburger collaboration on the school's Mill Creek program. And the Edison Schools formula didn't fit with what we had developed, this Mill Creek program, which is why the teachers left, one of the reasons why the teachers left. And then the housing project is built without the stormwater management demonstration plan that would have been green infrastructure. Instead, and guess why? Those of you who are landscape architects practicing may know that when the buildings get built, often the budget's been spent and there's nothing left for the landscape. So that's what happened here. And here you see the housing that was built, and you see Salzburger Middle School there in the distance. Okay, so that was all pretty depressing. It broke my heart to stop the work with the school. I think that was the hardest part, but then I also felt really terrible about the collapse of the work with the water department, because I thought that things were really going well. But then in 2009, I read in the Philadelphia Inquirer newspaper that the city had announced a new program, Green City Clean Waters, that was making the proposal that they would take care of their combined sewer overflow problem through green infrastructure. This plan calls for converting between 20 and 25% of the paved surfaces of the city to green, to stormwater detention or retention. So they did it. Wow. That was amazing. I called up the director of the watershed program and said, "Congratulations! How can I help? How about if I teach a course at MIT, and we will look at whatever issues. We'll concentrate within the Mill Creek watershed, but any issues that you're worried about, is this going to work? We'll test it out." And so we talked with them, and the students, my students, came down to Philadelphia. Here you see them meeting with the once director of the Urban Watersheds Program, is now the water commissioner, appointed because of, at least in part because of the success of this program. And here you see my students, my MIT students, presenting to the chief of staff of the water commissioner some of the findings of the students in the studio. There were a number of opportunities that they found for the water department, and they found that in the densest part of this low-income area in the Mill Creek neighborhood, you could still accommodate all of this, the stormwater runoff for the design storm that the water engineers were concerned with. So you can see these, you can see their projects online. My ecological urbanism class is now continues to work in this area, but success, finally. And it took, think of how many years it took. It takes time to change conventional ways of doing things. It just doesn't happen overnight. And I'm now writing a chapter, I'm writing a book called The Buried River, Restoring Nature, Rebuilding Community. And one of the chapters I've been writing is on the Green City Clean Waters program and investigating why did it take so long? And so I've been interviewing people in the water department about, and also people in environmental groups in Philadelphia about how it all evolved. And it's a very interesting story. But in any case, so you can follow all this work on the West Philadelphia Landscape Project website, on my own website, on the websites for my course at MIT, which is web.mit.edu/nature. But that's not the end. I've been working with the woman in the middle here, Frances Walker, since mid-1990s. It turned out that the work with the school brought me into contact with all of these adults in the neighborhood. And Frances reached out to me and asked me to become part of the Mill Creek Coalition's environment subcommittee. And we worked together in the late 90s. And she actually came on a fellowship to MIT after I moved to MIT. She came for a fellowship over the course of a year where she made several visits. So she called me up in 2018 and she said, "Anne, I have a problem." She said, "It's my mother's house. And here you see her mother, a photograph I took of her and her mother and her sister when her mother was 101. Her mother died a short while afterwards. And by 2018, Frances wanted to move back into her mother's house, but there was a hole in the roof, there was water pouring in, and she wanted me to help. And I said, "But Frances, can't you get, there are programs for low-income homeowners to help them with home repairs." And she said, "The problem is I'm not the owner. I don't have title to the house. My mother didn't write a will. There are 18 heirs. We're in back taxes. I need your help." I said, "Frances, I don't know anything about housing." And she said, "But I know you can help." I said, "Well, fortunately, I have a lot of colleagues at MIT in the Department of Urban Studies and Planning that know a lot about housing. And so I'll ask their advice and we'll start working together." And so Frances and I started on the next phase, this phase that we're currently in of the West Philadelphia Landscape Project called Holding Ground. How to help low-income homeowners stay in their homes. There's an epidemic among low-income homeowners in Philadelphia of what we call tangled deeds, which is what Frances had, that they don't have title to the place they're living. And they can, which means that they can easily lose it. Also, if you fall behind in your taxes by 3 years, the property can come to sheriff's sale. So it's a really very difficult issue. It also turns out, and as I got in and started studying this problem and trying to help Frances, I discovered that one of the things contributing to gentrification that's happening in this neighborhood that's been in disinvestment since the 1930s And here we are now, since 2010, there's been rampant speculation and gentrification. And the green infrastructure that the water department is building in these neighborhoods is not causing gentrification, but it is an element of gentrification. So there's a lot of scholars that are beginning to write about green gentrification. So all of this work I've been doing in my entire, almost my entire career to rebuild communities at the same time as improving the environment turns out to be a contributor to injustice. And so I face this kind of moral, ethical dilemma, right? So my work since 2018 has been with my students is how do we deal with not just the flows of water, but also the flows of capital, which, work together. And I talk to people in the neighborhood and they're saying, this is worse than redlining because these speculators put up these signs all over on telephone poles. We buy houses, fast cash. We buy brotherly love homes. Have a home, need cash fast, close quick. They even put stickers up on people's doors. We buy homes. We buy houses, not we buy homes. Oh no, these folks are saying we buy homes, brotherly love homes. So how do you combat this? Well, that's what my students have been addressing. And this past fall, and a year ago, a group of residents that were starting a new community garden reached out to me and asked me to help them out because I knew about the history of Mill Creek and they wanted to honor the history of Mill Creek. And they said, we're also working with a middle school. And I said, oh, where's the middle school? It's on the buried floodplain. So it's a different school, but it's about 3 blocks away from the previous school that I worked with. And the guy you see here in the upper left is the community liaison at the school and really dynamic. And so we've developed this partnership with the school. And my MIT students in my class this past spring, worked with the primary documents, just like my Penn students had in the 1990s, but through Zoom. And then we took, on our spring break in March, we went down to Philadelphia, and here you see me leading a tour of the Mill Creek buried floodplain with community residents and these 8th grade students who have been studying the history of the Mill Creek that semester. We walked along the buried floodplain, which you see here, and the blue line is the line of the former stream, and the blue zone is the buried floodplain. And at every stop we made, my students would take out the primary documents and work with their group of students. And here you see a student saying, wow, look at this. So I can't show you, I don't have time tonight to show you the work of the students, but I want to just show you a couple of things that are in the exhibit here at EPFL. One set of students, 2 students who worked together, developed an idea of posters, of putting up posters in the neighborhood with QR codes that you could link to get more information on the website. And they buy homes, gentrification, speculation, and tangled deeds. And so we went down at the end of the semester, those 2 students and I went down and went out in the neighborhood with the kids. And every time there was a We Buy Houses sign, they put up They Buy Home signs. We also, there were 5 different posters that my students, these 2 students made, but the other one that's in the exhibit is Body of Water Below, again with a QR code, telling people that they are standing on the river. Here you see them posting. So these posters only go along the buried floodplain. And here's a close-up of the poster, which you can see in the exhibit. You are standing on the Nagansee. That was the Lenape Indians' name for the Mill Creek. So you are standing on the Nagansee/Mill Creek. You are standing on the Nagansee/Mill Creek. The kids decided that they were going to write a book about the history of Mill Creek. This is the book they wrote, Honoring Mill Creek, Black Legacy Through a Buried River. So I want to just end with this note of, it's in our, I believe that it's part of our professional responsibility, not just to design a plan, but to educate, to advocate, and to demonstrate. And particularly here in universities, where we have the opportunity in studio courses and other courses to do the things that people in professional practice don't necessarily have clients who will pay them to do it. So just to go over a few reminders of some of the things that I've learned about in the process of this 40 years of work. When learning is real, youth can be agents of change. Landscape literacy is fundamental. Failure can be revealing. You know, the revelations of failure. I've told you just a series of some of the failures. There are others too, but I think that failures, when you reflect on them, it's kind of painful, but it's much nicer to reflect on success. But I find that it's easier to identify the reasons for failure than it is the reasons for success, because you can easily mislead yourself to think of, oh, it was because I did this, or, you know, whatever. Rationality and power. Just because something makes sense does not mean that it's going to get adopted. And I recommend Bent Foodberg's book, Rationality and Power, for all planners and landscape architects and architects. The power of example. Design experiments that get built, and then you see how they work. Universities as seedbeds of innovation, and the value of long-term research. So I want to end here to broaden out from this buried river, because the story of Mill Creek is about more than a buried river. The same ideas and forces that buried the river are those that have altered the atmosphere, producing rising temperatures, deadly winds and wildfires, floods and drought, and rising seas. The same ideas and forces that produce profound inequities among the communities of the buried river are those that have created a widening gulf in wealth and opportunity, causing displacement, despair, anger, and violence. The catastrophic cave-ins to come, magnified in scope and scale, threaten the collapse of environmental, social, and economic systems. To avoid that collapse will require new ways of thinking and working, new collaborations, new stories. What would it mean for a city to be ecologically robust and socially just? What would such a place be like? Through what means might such a vision be accomplished? And how might change be created and sustained? The West Philadelphia Landscape Project represents one small step to answering such questions. I invite you all to join me in the quest to answer the questions the buried river posed. And let me know of your progress. Meanwhile, for more on the West Philadelphia Landscape Project and to see ongoing work, WPLP.net and WhistonSpirn.com. For updates, connect with me on LinkedIn. Thank you.
Very important point to have been underlined, the relation with power, the passion to go through failures, the importance of long-term research, the role of universities. Today we know where are we in this changing world, but here, look at what trajectory. Where Anne, for example, she avoided at a certain moment to just start a private company and to become a successful landscape architect. to stay into the university because she believes in the role, fundamental role that has university exactly in digging through problems that have not yet been created or solutions have been given, and taking, the luxury to spend one entire life of research just to bring them to the public understanding, to the public opinion. So I'm sure you have questions, no? Isn't it? Please.
You mentioned that to change how people think about built space or how they handle these kind of situations, problems, areas, takes a long time, as you have shown. But do you think that at this point in how we as humans are affecting our environment, we have this time to do this for the next 40 years? Like, how do you envision these kinds of projects or evolutions in thinking? Can they happen with more urgency?
Yes, that's a great question. I think yes. And here's the reason. I say to my students in the ecological urbanism class that wherever they live, they should understand every place has environmental issues and social issues for that place. And well, now we have climate change, but the aspect, the type of problem that's going to hit a particular place, like in California, there are wildfires. Is it because I'm moving? I don't know either. Okay, so I say the thing to do is to know what those issues are, to develop a cadre of people that get together and develop some solutions, some ideas for a plan. And then when the disaster hits, the strongest impulse is to rebuild and to do it right. But the problem is the rebuilding, if there's not a plan in place, the rebuilding will just be to rebuild the way it was before. So the important thing is to be able to take advantage of these metaphorical cave-ins and to have some agreement about what should be done so that you can use these catastrophes as a positive. Now, I think what's happening with climate change, at least I can say in the US, is that it was denied for so long by so many people. It just simply didn't touch them. It was some, scientific statistics. But now we're seeing floods, the likes of which, in communities that have never experienced the flooding they're experiencing today. There are communities experiencing wildfires. So they're intensifying hurricanes. So I think that there's a growing understanding that's accelerating that we really have to do some things. And I think that I can speak for my own university at MIT. The president has said, we are going to have a climate initiative, and they're going to be funding for people in all fields within the university to work in your own fields to figure out how we can address these issues of climate change in terms of adaptation and in terms of adaptation to climate change and in terms of reducing climate change. And so I think that unfortunately human beings just don't move quickly out of the comfort zone, unless they perceive a catastrophe. When I finished the Granite Garden, as I mentioned, my book, I marshaled in each of those sections, air, earth, water, life, and ecosystems. I marshaled cases as evidence of how one could adapt cities to natural processes. I think only one of them, maybe two, were the result of a visionary who said, I'm going to build a new town in the middle of of a pine oak forest, and it's going to be designed and built in concert with natural processes. And he hired Ian McHarg's firm, where I was working, to do this project. It's illustrated in the exhibit. Now, I'm really hard pressed to identify the other cases were a response to catastrophe. You know, so let's just face it, as human societies, we don't. There's some exceptions, but we just don't seem to be able to marshal our forces to address issues unless we're faced with a catastrophe. And we are being faced with more and more catastrophe. So I think that the response is going to accelerate. And you all are going to be part of it because it's your generation. You know, I won't be here in 20 years probably, you know, maybe 25, but not beyond. And it's your, and what I'm trying to do so in the book that I'm writing on the buried river, the last section is, you know, this is not just about a buried river. You know, this is a much larger issue, and these lessons that I've learned through failures and successes in this watershed, in this particular city, in this particular community, there are lessons there for how to deal with climate change, for example. You know, and so you think metaphorically about these cave-ins. Yeah, so I think the lessons that I've learned from the West Philadelphia Landscape Project apply also to working with climate change. Yeah.
And what would be the biggest lesson you learned over the 40 years? Or the major one, you know, like you say, okay, change is about...
Wow. I don't know that I can say a single one, but I'll say a few. And one of them is that no community, no matter how poor economically, is without resources. That the lowest income, you will find in the lowest income community, wisdom and knowledge and resources. Maybe not economic resources, but lived experience and understanding that we can learn from. And so one of the things I learned from watching my students work with the middle school kids, and also myself working with community members, is this sense of mutual learning and teaching. So I'm always teaching, but I'm always also learning. My students are going in and they start out thinking they're going to be helping these kids, and then they find out how much they've learned from the kids. So that's really important. The other thing I think is, now we're dealing with climate change, youth are underestimated. Young people are not given enough to do. And 12, 13, 14-year-olds can have a lot of really interesting ideas. They can think outside the box. They can, these kids we're working with now with this new program with this middle school, we'll be working this year with the student council. And the idea is to help them understand the roots of the gentrification and speculation that's taking place. I forgot to say, 25% of the students in this school are homeless. 25% as a result of gentrification. And so they know about gentrification, but through their lived experience, but knowledge about what are the forces that are producing it. Once you understand that and the historical roots, perhaps you can come up with some ideas. And for the past since 2018, my students have been working on green gentrification and have produced a lot of reports that can be very useful to people. But how do we get it out there? And the kids could become a core of agents of change that go out into the neighborhood, talk to their neighbors, and teach them about, make these resources available to them. For example, the City of Philadelphia and other nonprofits have all of these programs that could be helpful to folks, but they're impossible to navigate on the internet. And if my students, graduate students, find them difficult to navigate, then imagine somebody who's not used to just searching the internet and finding them. So a lot of these programs go unknown to the very people for whom they would be useful. And wouldn't it be wonderful if these kids can learn about this and take these. The other thing is that the two universities in West Philadelphia are drivers of gentrification, not just because people coming there want homes to live in, but because those two universities have support, they give loans to staff and faculty to buy homes within a certain catchment area. And so it's expanding, it's ever expanding catchment area. So, however, imagine if folks in the neighborhood knew that if they got a job at Penn, they could be eligible for this type of support. So there are various different, I call them solutions but the kids could be amazing agents of change. And we've developed a GIS program that can identify the specific blocks that are most vulnerable to speculation. Now that's the one exception I've made to putting on the web. I won't put it on the web because it could be abused by the very speculators and developers. So we've made a password protected version that can be accessed by the city councilwoman's staff who is in this district and who's very concerned about affordable housing and people being able to remain in their homes. So that was a kind of, those two things, youth and people, I've been doing some research on programs where youth are agents of change, and people talk about youth as people in their 20s. But you should be talking about children. They shouldn't be, their energy and passion shouldn't be neglected.
First of all, I would like to thank you for sharing your experience. And it just came to my mind one question, and maybe which are the tools, or maybe the tools you've developed in order to defend ourselves and our enthusiasm and ideas from these green gentrification and this greenwashing also that takes on these issues.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the basic principles is that you need to be aware as a planner, a politician, whoever is involved in making plans. In the case of the water department, for example, they have a great social outreach to communities, and they let communities know when projects are coming online in their neighborhood, the green infrastructure. But I think that the outreach needs to be even earlier. When you first begin thinking that you might do a project in a particular community, you should put into place programs to protect the most vulnerable. And this can take many different forms. It can take the form of education, job opportunity that would link to job opportunities, which then people could afford to remain in their community. It could mean making people aware of programs that exist for that the city of Philadelphia has, for example, of giving people tax relief if they're low income and are homeowners. There are these various tools, but the most important thing is that you need to be planning for gentrification before you even start the projects. And by the time you're in design drawings and construction, it's too late. Well, it's never too late, but it really needs to be thought of. You need to be aware of the economic forces that you may be putting into motion. as a designer planner. I think it's part of our ethical responsibility is to understand that all of our work can have unanticipated consequences. And now we know that unanticipated consequences. I never dreamed of this neighborhood becoming gentrified because the disinvestment was so severe from the 1930s right through, you're talking about 70, 80 years of disinvestment. And it was unthinkable to me that there was going to be all of this speculation jumping in, but I missed it, It's and that's just a fact of life. No matter what we do, there are going to be unanticipated consequences. So you need to realize that, have some humility as a designer planner.
You showed us that you used digital technologies very early, like internet. Maybe you have other examples, but what advice would you give us as designers to leverage those technologies to gather a community?
Oh, yes. Well, I think it's a really powerful story. If you go to the WPLP.net website /stories, you'll see there are a series of short videos, and one is called Fatima's Story, and the other is called When Learning is Real. And the Fatima story is a story of a young woman who, as a 13-year-old, learned HTML code as part of our program, and was homeless after high school for a while, and then got a job because she knew HTML code and could make websites. And now she's a web developer, and all of her three kids are computer literate and are doing their own programming as teenagers. So that's the power of teaching kids young digital technology that then can lead to well-paying jobs. And you can also have an impact. It's not just one person, it's generations. So it's her children and their children and their children. And then the other video, which I think is really powerful, is, and these are all told in their voice, the 3 teachers that I worked with, and one of them was a computer teacher at the Salzburger Middle School, and he tells the story of how these kids, once they learned HTML, they went on to learn GIS, and then they started creating their own coding with GIS, and they identified issues in the neighborhood that GIS would help with. So it's very powerful. These are 11, 12, 13, 14-year-olds. So don't underestimate children. Don't underestimate them. And it gives them such a sense of power to be able to do this. My MIT students, 2001, I think it was, went down to, the graduate students in urban studies and planning, went down to visit the Salzburger Middle School. And I don't know what they were thinking, but they were blown away because these kids were doing things with GIS that they couldn't do, And they were refurbishing computers. So the whole program it started just with us teaching HTML. Actually, it was my son who taught them HTML because he had learned HTML, and I figured if he could learn HTML, he learned it when he was 15, that he could teach these kids, and he did. And then the computer teacher expanded on that idea. And so all the kids, the name of the teacher is Armstead, Don Armstead, and he had a group of kids that were called Armstead's Army, because whenever there was a problem with the network in the school, and the kids helped build the computer network, by the way. Whenever there was a problem with a computer, he would send off one of the kids, they'd get out of class, right, out of their class, to go to the other teachers and solve their computer problem. And I mean, it's extraordinary what children can do. So bring others in, it's not just for us to have expert knowledge and keep it for doing whatever we're doing. Share the expert knowledge, educate, advocate, demonstrate.
Yeah, we thank you for your presence. and for what you are, Anne. Thank you very much.
Yeah, you're welcome.